Could the Minnesota Wild be in the midst of a Calder Trophy winning dynasty? Plus, is positionless hockey the reason the Wild's offense is as good as it is, with centers playing out of position? We look at that and more today on Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen every day. And just as a reminder, Locked On Wild is free, and Locked On Wild is available wherever you listen to podcasts. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we look at how the phrase positionless hockey is a good way to describe how the Minnesota Wild have been able to get such great production out of Kirill Kaprizov and Matt Zuccarello and Kevin Fiala and Matt Boldy, despite having Ryan Hartman and Freddie Gaudreau as the centers for those lines. No shade on Ryan Hartman, by the way. But we'll talk more about that here today, as well as the fact that the Minnesota Wilds might be in the midst of a nice extended run of Calder Trophy finalists and winners over the next handful of seasons. My name is Seth Topal, host of Locked On Wild, your veteran captain of Locked On Wild, with over a decade's worth of experience covering your favorite Minnesota sports teams, and now covering the Minnesota Wild with all of my full attention. Happy to have you along on a Wednesday edition of the show. And the Wild will take on the Winnipeg Jets tonight. Marcus Foligno back. Matt Boldy, Matt Dumba, that is. Not sure his status heading into tonight's game as of yet. But for the Wild, they do get Foligno back. We'll get Foligno back. And so we'll just continue to get as close to full strength as possible. And hopefully the Wilds can pick up yet another win and get a little revenge against the Jets for what they did to the Wild back on Sunday, back last week to start off the All-Star, the second half after the All-Star break. We're not going to talk a whole lot about that game. We'll recap it for you coming up on Thursday's edition of the show. But I wanted to piggyback off a couple of things that we talked about to lead off the week with Alex Micheletti on Tuesday. And so we talk about this Minnesota Wild offense. You know, since Matt Boldy got put onto that second line with Kevin Fiala, things have just taken off, and that line dominated over the weekend and has really been playing some incredibly good hockey. I got to thinking after Alexis Pearson's last appearance, in which we were talking about Ryan Hartman as one of the unsung heroes of this Wild team. And the phrase positionless hockey came into the picture, kind of planted the seed of positionless hockey back when we talked to Alexis. And we look at it for this Minnesota Wild team. I think we have seen the Wild really tweak their approach this season as to how these lines operate, how these lines hum. And it is a nice, refreshing change of pace after the last, 10, 15 years of this franchise's tenure, in which really followed the forward, center, forward. Got to be a center to play center. Got to be a forward to play forward. Really stuck to those position groups, which led to a lot of guys that were not necessarily a top six center having to play it, and it led to some wings that were not necessarily top six wings having to play in those spots as well. The Wild have taken the standard approach in forward, center, forward, and have turned it on its head because let's look at the top line, for example. Kirill Kaprizov, if you think about it, Kirill Kaprizov is really the center for that top line. He's the one that handles the puck the most between him and Matt Zuccarello and Ryan Hartman. Yeah, Hartman is the one that takes the draws in the face-off circle, and that's a very important part of what the team is what the team's trying to do, trying to win those face-offs, get that zone time established. But if you really look at it, Kirill Kaprizov is the one that handles the puck. He's the one that sets up the action between him and Matt Zuccarello, and Ryan Hartman certainly plays into that as well. And so, if we look at whether or not the Wild should upgrade that center spot with both the Kaprizov line and now the Fiala line, I think part of what makes those two lines tick as much as it is that the Wild have embraced giving their top guys the puck as much as possible. Now, I'm not attempting to say that if the Wild made a trade for a top flight center that it would somehow weaken this team. It wouldn't. But I think the fact that you have, a guy like Ryan Hartman on that line allows for Kirill Kaprizov to take more of the spotlight and to take more of the responsibility with moving the puck around, bringing the puck up the ice, pushing the tempo. I think the fact that Hartman can act essentially as a wing on that line is a huge reason to why that team is as successful as it is. Because when Kirill's doing his thing, skating around the perimeter of the zone, finding his teammates, he's able to make those big plays that Ryan Hartman, that Matt Zuccarello just can't. Zuccarello, a very adept passer, but there's only one Kirill Kaprizov on the ice at any given moment. And giving him more opportunities when he is not able to simply score himself has just elevated the level of offense that this team brings to the table. And we're seeing it with Boldy and Fiala now too, as those guys are both very good at moving the puck up the ice, creating opportunities. And so that, is part of the reason that this line is excelling as much as it is with Freddie Gaudreau as your center. No knock against Gaudreau here either. He has certainly picked up his game over the last couple of weeks as well, but I think maybe if you put another center in there that leads to less ice time, less puck possession time for Fiala or for Boldy. It seems like the fact that those two guys are able to have the puck as much as they do, and Gaudreau can just, can help kind of move the play up the ice and be one of those supporting cast members for those two guys, I think is a reason that the success has been just as red hot as it has been. So I think we're going to see the term positionless hockey used a lot more here, not only this season but going into the future. And so, if you see that term used, if you hear that term out in every day, it just means that Kirill Kaprizov, despite being listed as a forward, listed as a wing on the roster, you could argue he's the one centering that top line. He just isn't taking the faceoffs. And if the results continue to speak for themselves, I think it's the right approach, and I think it's something that the Wilds can definitely explore as more players continue to be elevated on the roster and continue to make huge impacts for this team. Now, we talked about Matt Boldy. We've talked about him quite a bit over the course of the week so far, and Boldy cementing himself into the Calder Trophy discussion. But after this year, the Wild may not be done in terms of Calder Trophy finalists and potential winners. This dynasty is just getting started. We will look at some of the other names that could give a run for the Calder Trophy once they make the Wild roster. More to come on today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. The month of February is here, and so New Year's resolutions have been thrown out the window. But if you're still hanging on to yours to try to eat better or look better, Built Bar is here to help. If you've tried Built Bars but are looking for a little bit of a different twist, may I recommend the Puffs. Puffs are the first ever protein-infused marshmallow. They're fluffy, they're marshmallowy. They're not just a protein bar, they are a treat, and they're covered in 100% real chocolate. Most Built Bars contain 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. You can compare that to your standard candy bar with around 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, and dozens of net carbs. You can get 15% off of your next order if you head to built.com right now and use the promo code LOCKED15. So don't delay. Get a stack of Built Bars right to your door by using the promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. Continuing today's episode of Locked On Wild, and again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen every day. Make sure you also check out Olympic Hockey Daily, presented by Locked On NHL, a bonus podcast covering all the action in Beijing. You can find it on the Locked On NHL podcast feed. Olympic Hockey Daily is free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Continuing today's episode of Locked On Wild, throwing out a couple of other topics that we will dive into as the week progresses. And we saw Kirill Kaprizov win the Calder Trophy last year, celebrated it like crazy. We are seeing Matt Boldy kind of assert his claim into needing to be in the Calder Trophy discussion and to potentially be a finalist, depending on how his production continues to trend as the season goes on. That's just the tip of the iceberg for this Wild team and the talent that they have on the roster that could lead to the Wild becoming the preferred destination for Calder Trophy winners here in the 2020s. So Kaprizov already won it. Matt Boldy should end up being a finalist for the Calder Trophy this year, if not the winner. Ladies and gentlemen, one Marco Rossi could very well contend for the Calder Trophy next season, 2022-2023. Because if you look at what he is doing with the Iowa Wild here this season, Rossi currently sitting at over a point per game. He's got 38 points in 35 games, 14 goals, 24 assists. He got a little cup of tea with the Wild earlier this season, the Minnesota Wild, that is, and was sent back down to Iowa to finish kind of getting his legs underneath him and get ready for a full workload of NHL games coming next season. If Rossi can keep that production going at the NHL level, he's going to be one of the favorites to win the Calder Trophy next season, and he very well could be the favorite as it is right now. The guy is uber talented. He is gifted with the puck in his hands. He is a great passer. He is going to be just a force for the Minnesota Wild once he gets onto the NHL roster and gets his confidence level up at the NHL level. And so you could go from Kaprizov to Boldy to Rossi, but that's not all. Another name that could potentially 2 years from now is the goalie of the future for this Minnesota Wild team. I'm, of course, talking about Jesper Wallstedt. Now, his timeline is not as concrete as, say, Marco Rossi, because it's pretty obvious at this point that that Rossi will be making his way to the Minnesota Wild roster at the very least at the beginning of next season, if not at the end of this one. And so with Wallstedt, I think the hope is that he is on the Iowa Wild roster next year. But just look at what he's doing so far in the SHL. He has an 11-9 record. Don't let that fool you. 1.95 goals against average and a 918 save percentage. He just dominated in the World Junior Championships, despite them not being finished. And so let's say that Wallstedt does get to Iowa next season and lights it up, just tears it up, much like Matt Boldy did, and much like Marco Rossi is doing for the Iowa Wild right now. Tears it up, ends up making the Minnesota Wild roster 2 years from now, and ends up getting regular starts, depending on what the rest of the goalie situation looks like, ends up getting regular starts, and he ends up being in the Calder Trophy conversation, at least as a name that warrants consideration. I don't know if he'll be a finalist. I would hope that he will be, based off of what is projected of him. But you look at where this Minnesota Wild team is at. Super competitive this season with good prospects waiting in the system. If a ringing endorsement is not the fact that Kirill Kaprizov won it, I know he came in a little older, and so the expectations were that he was going to be good enough to do it. And you go from Kaprizov, you go to Matt Boldy, who at age 20 is on pace for a 67-point season, which is just absurd for somebody his age. If you go to him winning the Calder, then you go to Rossi winning the Calder, and you maybe go to Wallstedt winning the Calder after that. If that's not a ringing endorsement of what the Minnesota Wild have built to this point over the last couple of years through the draft, I don't know what is, because these are all guys that they have taken in the last couple of years, and they're already starting to make their impact on the NHL roster. And if those drafts continue, I mean, there's no shortage of players that you can throw into those conversations for bigger awards than the Calder Trophy. But this team, as these guys continue to make impacts on this roster, this team is going to continue to just be real good. So hopefully Boldy can continue to keep his pace up and can continue to be part of the conversation for the Calder Trophy and beyond. And hopefully his success leads to the Minnesota Wild continuing their success as well. But beyond him, there are still plenty of names that will give this Wild team plenty of success for the years to come. We will take a look at what to expect from the Winnipeg Jets in the rematch from the first game of the second half. We'll finish that out with today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Football season might be over, but basketball is in full steam for both pro and college hoops. From all the latest odds, totals, player performance props, to where to find the next fired coach is going to land, BetOnline.net is the #1 spot for all of your sports betting needs. BetOnline remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline.net is your source for hockey, boxing, and UFC, all the way down to Olympic coverage and information. So head over to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. You can find it all at betonline.net, where the game starts. Today's episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. With the ever increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning, like is your Odyssey an LX or an EX? And wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry. You have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. You can save time and money when using Rock Auto. Why choose to spend 30, 50, even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or car dealership? RockAuto.com is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. And RockAuto.com's prices are reliably low for every customer. So head to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Make sure to write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. All at rockauto.com. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. And again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen every day. Minnesota Wild taking on the Winnipeg Jets tonight, trying to get it right that time, trying to avenge the first loss of the second half of the season, a sleepy shutout by a score of 2-0. And right at that point in the season, in the start of the second half, tried to kind of downplay what the Jets were able to accomplish against the Minnesota Wild because of how good their offense has been this season and how much of an anomaly that 2-0 shutout was, considering how the rest of the season has gone so far. They're 11-1-1 in their last 13 games, just continue to be absolutely white hot on the season. But this will be a fascinating game to watch because it's going to let us know if the Jets have a tell as to how to properly defend this Minnesota Wild team. There were some elements of the Jets doing some things that frustrated the Wild, of course. The Wild, I didn't think played their best hockey out of the gate to start the game, and so had to kind of play catch up to try to get back into it. Obviously, with it only being a 2-0 score, and with the second goal being an empty netter, the Wild were in it all the way till the end. The thing that was just bizarre to me, I know you had the fights, and you had the just pent up resentment for both of these teams. I think if we're looking at a couple of things that will be key for the Wild to come away with the win in this one, I think controlling the penalties is certainly one of them. It'll be interesting to see with Marcus Foligno coming back for this game after getting suspended for 2 games because of the fight that he was involved in against the Jets. It'll be fascinating to see if he is able to show a little bit of restraint. Not to say that we don't want him to establish that tone on the ice, but just keep it within reason and try to make sure that it doesn't end up becoming a habit to spend a ton of time in the penalty box. I think he had 12 penalty minutes in that game against the Winnipeg Jets. The face-off dilemma is one big thing that pops out from this game. Now, face-offs are not the end-all, be-all in terms of whether or not a team is successful. I mean, obviously, your opponent can win a face-off where maybe you take control of the puck immediately, and it still goes as a face-off win for them. But you got the puck back right away as opposed to letting the team have it and control the puck for a long time. The Wild were 14 and 35 in the face-off circle against the Winnipeg Jets. That clocks out at a 28.6% success rate, which is real bad. And so I don't tend to get super worked up about the face-off disparity unless it's egregiously bad. Like if you end up winning 45% of your face-offs and the other team wins 55, that's not really something to drastically impact the game. But if you have a stretch like they had where Winnipeg is just winning every face-off, that tends to be a little bit of a problem. And you look at the guys that were responsible for those face-offs, not to super single anybody out. Joel Eriksson Ek had 3 face-off wins, 14 face-off losses. Ryan Hartman, 3 face-off wins, 11 face-off losses. I mean, Freddie Gaudreau had 5 wins and 6 losses in the face-off circle. Nico Sturm had 2 wins and 4 losses, so those guys were a little closer towards even. But yeah, I mean, you have to win those opportunities, or at least keep it even, to help so that the other team doesn't just continue to stack up opportunities to increase their zone time, which in turn increases shots and in turn increases your opportunities to come away with goals. So let's even those face-offs out a little bit here against the Jets tonight. And the other thing, it sounds like Cam Talbot will be in net for the Wild. And rightfully so. I mean, the Wilds are playing this appropriately in trying to just make sure that both goalies get enough play to stay warm down the stretch. And so Talbot coming into this matchup. Now with Cam, it's interesting because these two goalies almost have the polar opposite dynamic for how their games usually go. It seems like when Talbot is in net, he maybe allows an early goal, and after that, he really tightens up and is rock solid throughout, the rest of the game. And that was the case. That was actually not the case against Carolina because the Wild got off to the hot start, and Carolina scored a couple of times late to pull it to a one goal deficit. But going back to the game against the Rangers, gave up too early, and the Wild were able to rally to tie to win. And so for Cam, if he can avoid putting the team in that early hole, I think his confidence you can get his confidence up, get him get him locked in, get him moving. And I just honestly, with what the Wild have done to Connor Hellebuyck, if he does end up being the guy to start for the Jets, it's not going to surprise me at all if the Wild kind of rally and put this one away emphatically to try to wash out the taste of that previous Jets loss. So that will be tonight. We'll have more of a reaction to what we saw in the game for you on tomorrow's episode of Locked On Wild. And I think that's going to do it for today's episode. So now that your first listen of the day is done, make sure to head over to the Locked On NHL podcast, where you can get the full lowdown on everything going on in the NHL from your favorite Locked On hosts talking about their teams. Locked On NHL is available wherever you listen to podcasts. Just like Locked On Wild, we're available wherever you listen to podcasts. We're available anytime you want to listen to your podcasts. Also, make sure to check us out on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, also on YouTube. Make sure to subscribe and follow everywhere you can so that we can keep you up to date on all things Minnesota Wild. If a puck drops or big news drops in the state of hockey, Locked On Wild has you covered with new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.